The sky over New Manila in the year 2847 was the color of rust and regret, a perpetual bruise that stretched across the horizon like a wound that refused to heal. The sun barely visible through the layers of industrial smog and atmospheric decay that had settled over the city like a funeral shroud. Kael Voss stood on the rooftop of his crumbling apartment complex, breathing in air that tasted of copper and chemicals, air that had been recycled so many times it felt like inhaling the exhalations of a billion ghosts. And he watched the delivery drones slice through the haze like metal insects searching for dying flowers. The buildings around him were monolithic structures of grey composite material, their surfaces slick with condensation from the humidity regulators that kept the temperature at a survivable 98 degrees there. Windows darkened or shattered, reflecting nothing but the same oppressive sameness that characterized every corner of this dying world. Below him, the streets teemed with people who moved like automatons through their daily routines, their skin pale from lack of genuine sunlight, their eyes hollow from generations of nutritional deficiency, subsisting on the synthetic protein blocks and algae paste that the megacorporations distributed with the cold efficiency of a machine feeding livestock. The technology that surrounded them was advanced beyond the wildest dreams of their ancestors. Holographic displays flickered on every corner. Neural implants allowed instant communication. Autonomous vehicles glided silently through designated traffic lanes, yet all of it felt like a gilded cage. Beautiful machinery designed to distract from the fundamental truth that the world itself was collapsing, that the oceans had turned to acidic sludge, that the forests existed only in archived photographs, that real food, the kind that grew from soil and was kissed by rain, had become nothing more than a legend whispered in the dark corners of history. Kael could remember, or thought he could remember, a time before the Temporal Regulation Act of 2756, before the World Council had declared time travel a crime against humanity's linear progression, before they had destroyed every known temporal device and hunted down anyone who possessed the knowledge to build one, claiming it was to prevent paradoxes and timeline corruption. Too abundant, too painful, a reminder of everything humanity had squandered in its march toward this grey, suffocating future. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a low-frequency hum from the power grid, from the atmospheric processes, from the endless machinery that kept this civilization alive, but not truly living. And as Kael stood there, feeling the synthetic fabric of his weatherproof jacket against his skin, tasting the metallic temps of filtered air on his tongue, he reached into his pocket and felt the smooth surface of the temporal anchor he'd hidden there. The illegal device that was his gateway to a world of color and life and abundance. The tool of his criminal trade that made him both a savior and a smuggler in the eyes of those desperate enough to pay for a taste of what humanity had lost. The message came through on Kael's encrypted neural channel at exactly 3:47, a time when most of the city was locked in the chemically induced sleep that the government distributed through the water supply to ensure optimal rest cycles and productivity. But Kael never touched the tap water, surviving instead on the expensive bottled variants that the rich hoarded like liquid gold. But the words were clear enough. I need oranges, real ones, not the synthesized garbage, and I'll pay triple your usual rate, but they have to be from before the collapse. From when the sun still fed the earth instead of burning it. Kael sat up in his narrow bed, his heart rate spiking as his implant registered the biometric changes. Because oranges were a luxury beyond measure, a fruit that required not just a trip to the past, but a trip to a very specific past, to a time when citrus groves still existed. When the climate hadn't yet turned the growing zones into desert wastelands. He'd done simpler jobs before bringing back bottles of clean groundwater from the 1990s, smuggling seeds from heritage vegetables that no longer had viable growing conditions, once even retrieving a living honeybee in a stasis chamber for a collector who wanted to see the creature that had once pollinated a third of humanity's food supply. But oranges meant exposure, meant spending enough time in the past to locate a source to acquire the fruit without disrupting the timeline, to return without being detected by the Temporal Compliance Division's quantum sensors that could detect chronological anomalies up to 72 hours after a jump. He responded with a single word: location. The coordinates came through immediately, an address in the luxury sector, that walled district where the corporate elite lived in their climate-controlled biodomes, breathing purified air and eating actual vegetables grown in hydroponic gardens that cost more to maintain than the annual budget of an entire lower district. Kael dressed quickly, pulling on his reactive camouflage jacket and checking the charge on his temporal anchor, the device no larger than a pocket watch but infinitely more valuable, its crystalline core pulsing with a faint blue light that seemed to shimmer with the promise of escape. As he made his way through the dark streets, past the homeless clusters huddled around heat vents, past the automated security drones that scanned every face against the criminal database, he couldn't shake the feeling that this job was different, that something about the request felt off. Too convenient, too desperate, the kind of setup that the TCD might use to flush out time smugglers like himself. But the money being offered was enough to buy him 3 months of real food, enough to upgrade his anchor's stealth capabilities, enough to maybe, just maybe, save enough to make one final jump and never come back to find some moment in the past where a man could disappear and live out his days breathing clean air and drinking water that did untaste like industrial runoff. When he reached a meeting point, our abandoned warehouse on the border between the commercial and industrial zones, he found not the wealthy client he'd expected, but a young woman, barely 20, her eyes wide with fear and something else, something that looked like zealous determination. And she held out a data chip with trembling hands and said, "It's not for me, the orange is there for the resistance, for the people who are planning to expose the truth about why time travel was really banned, and if you help us you'll finally understand what you've been running from all these years." Kael should have walked away, should have triggered the emergency protocols that would have wiped his location data and scattered false trails across the city's surveillance network, but something in the woman's eyes, her name was Sira, she told him, like the archaic word for evening, held him frozen, and against every instinct honed by years of illegal temporal trafficking, he found himself following her down into the subterranean levels beneath the warehouse, through maintenance tunnels that smelled of ozone and decay, past forgotten infrastructure from the city's earlier iterations, until they reached a hidden facility that hummed with unauthorized power consumption. The space had been converted into a makeshift operation center, walls lined with salvaged screens displaying data streams that Kael's implant couldn't quite pass, and in the center of it all stood a temporal mapping array, illegal technology that could track chronological disturbances across the entire timeline, the kind of equipment that would earn everyone in this room a mandatory neural wipe and life imprisonment in the labor colonies on Mars, Sira explained as they walked, her words tumbling out in a rush of desperation and conviction. The Resistance had discovered that the World Council's ban on time travel wasn't about preventing paradoxes at all, but about hiding something catastrophic, something that had happened in the year 2301 that had set humanity on this trajectory toward extinction, and they believed that somewhere in the past, before that pivotal moment, there existed evidence of what had been done and who had done it. The oranges were a test, she said, a way to verify that Kael could navigate the temporal barriers that the Council had erected around certain sensitive periods in history. Kael's hands were sweating as he examined the mission parameters on the ancient tablet Sarah handed him. He would need to jump back to June 15, 2089, to a specific orchard in what was once called California, retrieve exactly 3 oranges as proof of concept, but also plant a quantum recorder that would document any temporal interference patterns in that region. Any evidence that others had been visiting that time period for purposes the Council wanted hidden. The journey itself would be the most dangerous he'd ever attempted, requiring him to punch through not 1 but 3 separate temporal lockouts, military-grade countermeasures that could fry his anchor's circuits, or worse, strand him in a temporal loop where he de-experienced the same moment over and over until his mind fragmented into madness. He spent 6 hours preparing, recalibrating his anchor with equipment the Resistance had somehow acquired, eating a final meal of protein paste that tasted like absolutely nothing while Sarah briefed him on the extraction protocol, on the safe houses in the past that the Resistance had somehow established, on the emergency codes that would signal if he needed immediate recall regardless of mission completion. When the moment came when he stood in the center of the temporal displacement chamber, with its walls lined with Faraday mesh and quantum dampeners, when Sarah initiated the countdown and the air around him began to shimmer and distort like reality itself was melting, Kael felt the familiar sensation of his atoms being pulled apart and reassembled across the dimension of time, felt the universe stretch and compress, felt every moment of his existence flash before him in a recursive cascade of memory and possibility. And then he was standing in sunshine so bright it actually hurt his eyes, breathing air so clean and sweet it made him dizzy, staring at trees heavy with fruit that glowed like jewels in the golden light of an afternoon in a world that didn't yet know it was doomed. Kael stood in that orchard for what felt like an eternity, his legs trembling, his lungs burning with air that was too rich, too pure, too full of life for a body that had evolved to survive on recycled atmosphere and synthetic supplements. And as he reached out with shaking hands to touch the rough bark of an orange tree, feeling the texture of real wood for the first time in his life, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The quantum recorder that Sarah had given him, the device that was supposed to be passive, merely observing temporal patterns, was displaying active signatures, chronological disturbances that indicated not historical visits, but concurrent ones, meaning that someone else was here, now, in this same moment, operating in this same slice of the past. He moved carefully through the rows of trees, following the signal strength displayed on his implant, his heart hammering against his ribs like a prisoner demanding release. And that when he saw them, 3 figures in temporal displacement suits far more advanced than his own crude equipment, their faces obscured by helmet visors, and they were harvesting, not just oranges but soil samples, water samples, even taking core samples from the trees themselves, operating with the efficiency of trained scientists on a critical mission. Kael activated his suit's camouflage field and moved closer, close enough to overhear their conversation, and what he heard shattered everything he thought he knew about his world, about history, about the very nature of the reality he'd been born into. They were talking about the optimization, about acceptable losses in the timeline correction, about how the agricultural collapse of the mid-22nd century had been a necessary sacrifice to achieve the population reduction targets. And one of them, a woman whose voice carried the authority of command, said with clinical detachment, the councillor's decision to introduce the phosphate-binding algae into the ocean ecosystem in 2301 remains the most effective method we've found. The projections show complete oceanic ecosystem collapse within a century, soil depletion shortly after, and a managed decline that will reduce the human population to sustainable levels by 2850. Kael felt his reality fracturing, felt the ground beneath his feet become unstable even though he knew intellectually that the earth itself had moved. Because what she was describing wasn't a natural catastrophe, wasn't the result of humanity's carelessness and greed, but a deliberate act of genocide, a slow-motion extinction event engineered by the very people who claimed to be humanity's guardians. And suddenly every piece of his world's history clicked into a new, horrifying pattern. The collapse hadn't been a tragedy, it had been a plan. The dying oceans and poisoned soil and extinct species were the consequences of industrial excess, but the intended outcome of a conspiracy that stretched across centuries. His hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped the quantum recorder, as he set it to maximum sensitivity, capturing every word, every visual detail, every scrap of evidence that could prove what he was witnessing. And that when the figures turned when their sensors detected his presence despite his camouflage, and he saw their faces clearly through the visors, saw people he recognized from the newsfeeds, council members who appeared regularly on the public broadcasts, leaders who spoke with solemn voices about humanity's duty to preserve what remained, about the sacrifices necessary for survival, about the dangers of looking backward when they should be focused on the future. The woman who had spoken, whom Kael now recognized as Councillor Sarah Chen, the very architect of the Temporal Regulation Act, smiled at him with the expression of infinite sadness and said, "You were never supposed to see this, Kael Voss. We've been monitoring your jumps for months, waiting to see if you stumble onto the truth or remain a useful idiot ferrying luxuries to the desperate rich. And now that you know, now that you understand that your entire civilization's suffering is by design, you face an impossible choice. You can try to expose us, try to show people that their world was murdered by those sworn to protect it. But who will believe you, a common criminal, a time smuggler, when we control every media outlet, every information channel, every historical archive? Or you can join us, help us complete the work, because the truth is even darker than you imagined. Humanity was killing the planet so thoroughly that our models showed complete biosphere collapse and human extinction by 2400, so we made a choice. We decided that some humans surviving in a controlled decline was better than all humans dying in ecological apocalypse. We decided to play God because God wasn't going to save us." Kael wanted to scream, wanted to rage against the monstrous logic that had condemned billions to slow starvation, that had stolen clean air and fresh water and the simple joy of fruit growing on trees from every human being born after the optimization, wanted to reject the utilitarian calculus that had weighed lives against lives and decided that mass suffering was preferable to total annihilation. But a terrible part of him, a logical part that he hated with every fiber of his being, understood the mathematics of it, understood that these were people who had looked into the abyss of human extinction, and chosen the only path they could see that led to survival, even if that path was paved with the bones of billions.